This is the lecture for Alison Jaggar's L'Imagination à Pouvoir, comparing John Rawls's method of ideal theory with Iris Marion Young's method of critical theory. So the first topic is ideal theory and Rawls, and this hopefully sounds familiar from the last reading, the last lecture, and then, as I mentioned in the last lecture, some other stuff that we've read and talked about in this course. And so this article has kind of like three ways of understanding Rawls as doing ideal theory. Uh, the last two I sort of mentioned in the previous lecture, and the first is kind of new to this article. So the first one, she says that for Rawls, the philosophical, this is on page 60, the philosophical priority that Rawls gives to articulating general principles suggests that ideal precedes non-ideal, in the sense that particular injustices can be properly recognized only in the light of a comprehensive conception of justice. So that's a sense in which she's saying, look, Rawls has this kind of ideal theory. We understand specific injustices in light of our general principles of justice and the way that specific injustices sort of like contradict or go against the general principles of justice. I don't know if that's what Rawls is really saying. I think it's maybe worth going back and looking at Rawls to see, does he say this anywhere, or what does he actually endorse this view? As Jaggar points out, Rawls certainly does not say that practice can be deduced from principle. Indeed, his method of reflective equilibrium, which tests the adequacy of general principles by reference to their practical implications, denies the primacy of principle over practice. So, I mean, even she's pointing out that Rawls is not saying, oh, principles are the only important thing, practice is entirely irrelevant. You can only talk about practice once you first completely fix the principles. So she accepts that Rawls has some sort of interplay between practice and principles, which is more complicated than just like, principles are the most important. You work those out first, and then you decide practice. But then, she says, nevertheless, he gives priority to general principles. So yeah, maybe that's a way in which he's doing kind of like an ideal kind of theory. It's talking about ideal principles of justice rather than looking at practical stuff. And then the second and third ways that Rawls is doing ideal theory, according to her, we also saw in the last lecture. So she talks about sort of ideal theory in the sense of when you imagine people reasoning in the original position, you're kind of giving like an idealized picture of reasoning. You're supposed to be kind of making them into better reasoners by putting them behind the veil of ignorance. So we're imagining sort of like perfectly rational people making decisions, and that's a kind of idealization. And then finally, again, as I mentioned in the last lecture, Rawls is working out the conception of a well-ordered society, and that involves people all following the rules. He talks about everyone is presumed to act justly and to do his part in upholding just institutions. And so this is like an idealized picture of society. And then she also notes the society is a closed system, isolated from other societies. So just again, a reminder that this is the way in which Rawls is ideal. Related to this this idea of idealism or idealization, there's another sort of division or another sort of categorization method we might think about for political theory, and that's the particularism versus generalism approach. And so she says, Young's overall philosophical project, so this article is about Iris Marion Young and Rawls. Young's overall philosophical project, like Rawls, is to provide overarching normative ideals capable of clarifying specific injustices and shaping the design of real-world institutions. Like Rawls, she rejects particularism, which eschews all general principles. So if you're a particularist, you kind of say, you don't kind of say, you say, there are no general principles that apply to politics or political theory or anything like this. We can say practical things about particular circumstances, so we can look at something and say, this is unjust because XYZ, or this is better than this because of ABC. We can say particular things about particular cases, but there are no general principles according to the particularist. We can't sort of give rules that apply to every case, which explain why there's one injustice here, a different injustice here, no injustice over here. There are no general principles. There might be like rules of thumb that sum up common things that we see. Maybe like often you get injustice in these circumstances or something. But it's not a principle that applies universally or consistently or anything like this. So that's the particularist. The particularist says there's no sort of general principles that apply in political theory. And I don't think we've read anybody in this class yet who is a particularist, or at least we haven't read anybody who's explicitly a particularist or anybody who's making a big deal out of being a particularist. Maybe Williams would be a particularist, but I don't actually think so. I think he does have a general principle, at least one, this sort of like basic legitimation stuff. But anyways, I don't think we've read any particularists so far. And as Jaggar points out in this article, the two people she's comparing, Young and Rawls, they both reject particularism. So neither of them endorse particularism. They both think there are general principles. But she says, unlike Rawls, however, Young does not aim to develop a theory of justice that both stands independently of a given social context and yet measures its justice. In Young's view, if a theory were truly universal and freestanding, it would be too abstract to be useful in evaluating actual institutions and practices. So Young is okay with general principles, but she doesn't want the principles to be too universal, to be too abstract. And she doesn't want the principles to be independent of a given social context. So the principles that Young wants to develop are specific to a certain social context. And Jaggar goes on to say, thus Young rejects Rawls's aspiration in his earlier work to develop a theory of justice that's analogous to a scientific theory. The idea being Rawls is trying to do this kind of universal principles that apply to every society, whereas Young is doing particularist, sorry, I shouldn't have used that word, is using like specific principles that apply to specific or contextual principles that apply to in the context of a society. So that's the particularism versus generalism debate about principles. And it's also worth thinking, is Rawls actually trying to come up with universal principles? When Jaggar says, look, Young thinks if a theory were universal and freestanding, it would be too abstract. Is Rawls trying to come up with a universal and freestanding theory of justice? I sort of, in class when we were talking about Rawls, I questioned whether he's trying to do this. Like some people had characterized his theory as universal, and I wrote it on the board, and we had a discussion. I say discussion. It was mostly me talking at you and saying, well, I don't know. Look and see whether he thinks it's universal. And then specifically, I had said, the method of reflective equilibrium, what you do is you take the principles that you generate and your existing considered judgments, and you try to get them to fit together. And sometimes that means revising the principles so they fit your considered judgments. So I don't know, is that universal? Does everybody have the same considered judgments? Is everybody going to arrive at the same answer if they're taking their considered judgments and mushing them up with the principles and seeing what comes out? It doesn't sound very universal to me if people have different considered judgments. But I don't know, maybe everybody has the same considered judgments about justice, and so maybe it is universal. I don't know, it's worth thinking about. And finally, this is just a note, something. So this topic that we're doing this week is feminist political philosophy. There's a million things we could have read. As for every topic we talk about, there's a million things we could have read. One common thing people often read is this article or this argument by Susan Moller-Oken about Rawls's theory of justice and the degree to which Rawls's theory kind of incorporates or rationalizes gendered injustice in the family. And so this is just to sort of note that there's an interesting debate about this. Like Oken has her kind of objection to Rawls that he's sort of leaving out the importance of family dynamics on justice. But it's worth remembering that, when we read Rawls and he's talking about what justice applies to, and he says justice applies to the basic structure of society, the things in society that sort of regulate how people's life go on a broad scale, the things that are very impactful on people's lives. And when he's talking about what makes up the basic structure, he says the Constitution, the government, and another one of the examples he gives of the basic structure is the family. So he says the family is part of the basic structure of society, and the basic structure is what has to obey these principles of justice. So I don't know. It's worth thinking about. Is Rawls really kind of ignoring justice in the family, like the importance that the family has on how justice is sort of created and how it works in real life, or is he willing to sort of maybe radically alter the family so that it fits the principles of justice? Because the principles of justice require equal basic liberties for all, and then distribution of resources have to be according to fair equality of opportunity, and departures from equality are only justified if this benefits the worst off. And so he thinks the family, like other parts of the basic structure, has to be set up to ensure this. So if, I don't know, certain familial arrangements that we currently have are inegalitarian, they lead to departures from equality which don't benefit the worst off, then I don't know, we need to radically change the family to fix that sort of thing. So again, we're not reading this stuff. We sort of, I thought about it, but no. But if you're interested, you can, of course, ask me, and I can send you the Oken readings and stuff. So this is one interesting debate in feminist political theory.